Whether you look at the world ideologically, geopolitically, economically, it's becoming much messier, much more fluid, much more complex. I think that any sustainable foreign policy has to reflect that complexity.
I find BRICS is often going around with a sort of a bigger stir pot of other buzzwords. We're in multipolar world, we're in New World Order, end of hegemon, Cold War, right?
Will the United States win this putative new Cold War with China, or will China win? And I think that the question is wrong. I think that the expansion of the BRICS embodies this phenomena. More and more middle powers, more and more developing countries are saying, look, we don't have to make a strategic choice between the United States or between China. And so we can leverage that. The question for the United States, its allies and partners, is not how to achieve a decisive victory, but instead how to maintain a tense cohabitation that's maximally favorable.
This is the Global Gambit.
Time means many different things, but this time it means the BRICS. Yeah, your good old favorite subject. Genuinely, everybody, I am considering doing a PhD in this subject because it's just PhD in BRICS, great powers, strategical competition, world order, big stuff. And joining me to talk big stuff is the big man himself, Ali Wyne. He is someone we've had on the conversation before on the Global Gambit. He's the senior analyst with Eurasia Group and its global macro/geopolitical practice, where he focuses on US-China relations and great power competition. So basically my favorite thing. And we're going to be talking about that, but largely in the context of BRICS. Ali, it's lovely to have you back on. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. Great to be with you.
Yeah, no. Let's jump straight into it. So, why is BRICS so idealized, right? And to contextualize my question for people, whenever we listen to the BRICS, we hear people going, it's the end of the Western order, it's the end of the US hegemony, it is, the BRICS will replace the United Nations, I've heard people say, which is obviously rather a far-fetched concept because they're two very different things. But clearly, if you don't study international relations or understand how they work intricately, you think that it's possible. Why are people so obsessed with the BRICS?
So I agree with your characterization. And I think that, the reason for, speaking of it in these perhaps, I think hyperbolic terms is it does capture a certain zeitgeist. I think the expansion of the BRICS, and we were just talking a little bit before joining the conversation, that it is significant that you had in the run up to the summit that just took place in Johannesburg. It's significant that you had something like 40 countries that either formally or informally expressed an interest in joining. So clearly we can say, and I think that the expansion of the BRICS embodies this phenomena, more and more middle powers, more and more developing countries are saying, look, we don't have to make a strategic choice between the United States or between China. And in fact, we can flip the script. The United States is trying to court us. China is trying to court us. And so we can leverage that courtship to enhance our freedom of maneuver when it comes to foreign policy. So I think one reason people are focusing a lot on the BRICS is that it seems to embody something of a zeitgeist in global geopolitics. Again, this desire for greater agency on the part of a growing swath of countries. But having made that point, I now want to shift focus a little bit, but to get to, I think, kind of the undercurrent of your premise, with which I fully agree. There's a tendency to exaggerate how transformative a given event will be. There's a tendency to exaggerate how dramatic a shift a given development represents in the evolution of geopolitics. And so I think that it's important that while we don't diminish that zeitgeist that BRICS Plus embodies, I think by the same token, it's important that we not aggrandize it. So if you look at the founding five, so to speak, so the original BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. South Africa joined in late 2010, and China was a forceful proponent of South Africa's inclusion. Even if you just restrict your focus to the founding five, forget about the 6 countries that have come on board. If you just look at the founding five, even there were very strong divisions. And I think particularly between India and China, and that rivalry is only intensifying. But it wasn't just the India-China rivalry. If you look at the founding five, China and Russia wanted to make the BRICS, and they continue to want this expanded BRICS to be explicitly a countervailing coalition. They want to define the BRICS as explicitly anti-United States, anti-West. If you look at the other members of the founding five, so if you look at India, if you look at South Africa, if you look at Brazil, they want to enhance their autonomy. They want to enhance their freedom of maneuver when it comes to foreign policy, but they don't want the BRICS to be explicitly anti-United States or anti-West. Now, if you look at the 6 countries that have joined, my argument would be that only one of those countries shares the view of China and Russia, or shares the desire of those 2 countries to make it explicitly anti-United States and anti-West, namely Iran. But if you look at the other 5 countries that have joined, their foreign policy orientations, I would say, are much more similar to those of Brazil, India, South Africa. in many ways, with this expanded grouping, it's arguably even less geopolitically cohesive because now it embeds two key bilateral rivalries: India versus China, which existed in the original grouping, but now also Saudi Arabia versus Iran.
But the Saudi Arabian-Iranian dynamic there has been improved because of the very, PRC. So do you not think that there is a propensity for countries?
I agree. No, I agree with you that I think that the dynamic has changed. And I think certainly, if I were China, I would chalk up this normalization deal, this tentative normalization deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran. I would chalk it up as a diplomatic victory if I were in China. But having said so, there's a lot of work to be done to translate a normalization deal that exists on paper into a genuine détente, into a genuine rapprochement. Iran and Saudi Arabia have a very long history of distrust. They have a very long history of this open rivalry for preeminence in the Middle East. And so I don't think that a normalization deal obviates, that distrust. But even here, it's interesting. If you look at just Saudi Arabia and Iran, we see a difference in how they think about China, how they think about the United States. Again, Iran, I think that Iran is decisively tilting towards China. And I think that Iran feels like Russia feels, that one of its best bets for keeping its economy afloat, overcoming diplomatic isolation, is to ride the coattails of the preeminent challengers of the United States. Mm-hmm. If you're Saudi Arabia, you look to the United States and China for very different reasons. So if you're Saudi Arabia, you don't look to China for security ties. You still value the security ties that you have with the United States, but you look to China and you say, well, look, there's growing scope for enhancing energy ties. There's growing scope for enhancing overall economic ties. And so even the way that Saudi Arabia and Iran approach the United States and China, you see a tension between their foreign policy approaches, not only regionally, but globally.
Yeah. No, and to build on that point is this genuine idea of, we could talk about sort of a regional Cold War or a broader Cold War or multipolarity. And the reason I'm throwing in all these buzzwords is because that's sort of how I want to frame the other point with you, which is I find BRICS is often flung around with a sort of a bigger stir pot of other, as I say, buzzwords. We're in multipolar world, we're in new world order, end of hegemon, Cold War, right? I personally, maybe we can have this for a future conversation. I personally don't think we're in a new Cold War because I think China is a very different actor to the Soviet Union. But, I definitely already think we're in a version of multipolarity, and it's just becoming more cemented in the eyes of people around the world, in the eyes of policymakers. What's your opinion about those relations of BRICS, right? And to land this question with this example is China brought out a very controversial map which redefined its borders, including Russia. But what has the Kremlin said? Absolutely nothing. They've been muted. And that's because Russia knows at this point they're in bed or very much in tandem with the Chinese. That's their best bet for prosperity, survival, whatever. How did you see the map, and what do you think about the other buzzwords that I've mentioned in the context of BRICS?
Sure. So a few thoughts. Number one, I think it's important to recognize, and this point I think is going to become more and more important as we evaluate the behavior of, and even here there's actually now sort of this burgeoning nomenclature. So non-aligned powers, multi-aligned powers, unaligned powers. Even there in trying to characterize how this growing swath of countries is behaving, even now there's this whole broadening vocabulary. But I think that to your point, I think the two propositions can be true. I think that proposition one can be that you have a growing number of countries that want to escape the strictures of great power competition. A growing number of countries have certain apprehensions about Western influence. That's proposition one. Having said that, apprehensions about Western influence do not necessarily imply or necessarily translate into affinity for China's conception of its role in the world or for Chinese foreign policy. And there are many countries that simultaneously harbor concerns about Western influence, but also are concerned about the directions in which China is going, whether the way in which China is cracking down on civil society more and more domestically, the human rights abuses that it's carrying out domestically, the way in which it's asserting itself more and more in its near abroad. So I think that more and more countries are saying, look, we reject the notion of a G2 world. We don't want to be taking our cues from any one other country. We want to be more pragmatic. And I think I was having a conversation just a few days ago with a colleague, and I said, I think a real exemplar in this regard is India. And I imagine we'll talk a little bit more about India.
We certainly will.
India, I think, has been it's been very shrewd in its diplomacy. And I think that India, in many ways, it's pragmatic, it's omnidirectional, and it's responsive to, I think it's responding to shifts in geopolitics in a creative way. So if you're India is strengthening its relationship with the United States, but it's not proceeding in lockstep with the United States. And so we see divisions between the United States and India when it comes to Russia. So even as India is strengthening its relationship with the United States, it has a residual relationship with Russia. India is strengthening its relationships in the Gulf, but it also has a residual relationship with Iran. And so I think that Indian diplomacy is very much an exemplar for how many other countries are thinking in the BRICS, in the original BRICS, but also in the expanded grouping. Number one. Number two, to this point about sort of the polarity of the international system, I think it's fair to argue that the international system in the aggregate is becoming more multipolar, but I think that it's important to distinguish. I think that we lose a little bit of nuance when we talk about the international order or the world order. There are, in fact, constituent orders. And so you can think about kind of a security or military order. You can think about an economic order. You can think about a technological order. And here I'm basically adapting a framework that the founder and the president of Eurasia Group has promulgated, Ian Bremmer. So in his recent TED Talk, he advocates for sort of parsing out and taking this kind of nebulous notion of the international order and breaking it down into constituent orders. And I think that one of the virtues of breaking it down in that way is that you see that multipolarity is more advanced in certain domains than in other domains. I think that in the global security domain, China is nowhere near approaching the United States as the principal player when it comes to global security. In the economic domain, it's more multipolar, but even here now, there are questions about, you look at some of the growth headwinds in China.
Functionality of China's economy, the youth employment, the demographic crisis. This year, China's been overtaken by India almost the same week that we saw them first, long-term demographic decline by 900,000 people. These are not, the economic headwinds facing the Chinese economy, single figure growth for yet another year, less than 5%. I've seen a lot of major forecasters predicting for this year. That's not what you want for a country that's supposed to be the workhouse of the globe, of the global economy. So no, 100%. And that's not withstanding the troubles and challenges that the West faces. But
just to build on this point, the one that you just made, this is also one of the reasons why I think that there are many lessons when I say we, I think we in the West, I think that there are many lessons that we can and should learn from the Cold War. I'm wary of over-learning lessons from the Cold War, because I think that geopolitical dynamics and geoeconomic dynamics are very different today than they were during the Cold War. But two, of also learning the wrong lessons. And when I think about the United States and China, my sense is that, a lot of observers tend to look at the relationship through sort of the broad framework of power transition theory. So there's a lot of discussion of who will win. Will the United States win this putative new Cold War with China, or will China win? And I think that the question is wrong, because implicit in the question is that there will be, as there was during the first Cold War. So we can look back on the first Cold War and we can say the United States won and the Soviet Union lost. You can't theoretically rule out the possibility that China collapses in Soviet-style fashion. You cannot theoretically rule out the possibility of a hot war that China loses so badly that China is permanently defeated. But I think that those are very low outcome scenarios. My guess is that a power transition is less likely than a tense, fluid coexistence. A tense, fluid coexistence in which China's competitive strengths are sufficient enough that it won't be excised from the international system, but its competitive liabilities are sufficiently great in number and severity that China won't be able to replace the United States as the world's preeminent power. Now, if you accept that hypothesis, I'm just speculating here, but if you accept the hypothesis that the U.S.-China rivalry is not going to culminate in a decisive resolution, then the question for the United States, its allies and partners, is not how to achieve a decisive victory, which again, is kind of illusory in this context, but instead, how to maintain a tense cohabitation that's maximally favorable to the United States' interests and values. And that latter undertaking is more complicated. And I would argue that there may not even be a precedent historically for that undertaking. But I think that it's an undertaking that should allow the United States to be more creative in its diplomacy. And it should also give us a little bit of breathing room that, look, this rivalry, it's not as though we only have a narrow time horizon in which to settle this rivalry decisively. I think we have a longer time horizon to think creatively and energetically with our diplomacy.
No, 100%. And on the, we've touched upon China, and there are a couple of countries I want to use as, brief case studies in our conversation. One of which is India. But on the foreign policy standpoint, on its place in the world, I mean, I agree with Ian's perspective about you need to put things into different themes, buckets. That's how we distinguish between different types of powers, right? It's all well and good to say that the US is a hyperpower, whilst the other great powers or superpowers, right? But in what context are we talking about? And so it's applicable to the power scenarios as well. But for India, I think they've done a remarkable job with their strategical autonomy over the past 70, 80 years. And they're never, at least for me, incorporated enough into great power competition or great power opportunity, to quote your book from last year, which will be in the description for everyone interested. And I don't understand why. India, I really don't think, they are one of the core components of the BRICS. They very much want to remain on good terms with the US, not because they feel they have to, but because it benefits them. It's a very pragmatic, it's a very transactional approach to things. Why is India not taken more seriously in this regard? And do you think that they could be one of the core leaders in the BRICS, in a sort of, if you've got two camps, China, Russia, Iran, and then the India and more non-aligned entities, would you see that being the case?
I've always been struck, and I agree with your premise, I've always been struck by the degree to which it's underappreciated in these conversations. To make this point historically, compare India and Russia. So some observers will say, Russia is a great power because it has the world's largest nuclear arsenal. Okay, but India is a nuclear armed power as well. Mm-hmm. India has a larger population. India has a larger economy. So right now I'm just comparing India and Russia.
Oh, for sure.
But I think that if you even look further beyond, it's far more diplomatically engaged than Russia is. It's far more diplomatically agile than Russia is. And I think that if you look at, going further out, I think that, many of the trend lines for India are very favorable. If you look at its ratio, it has a very vibrant working age population. India is making very significant investments in critical and emerging technology. India this year and next year is projected to grow faster than China. Now, I'm not saying that India doesn't have its challenges. India's economy right now is 5 times smaller than China's. India faces a number of internal challenges, and I think that Indian officials would be the first to identify those challenges. But it does strike me, and one other sort of telling indication of this kind of disconnect between India's self-evidently growing importance and the residual extent to which it tends to get discounted in these conversations. Look at the growing number of countries that have published Indo-Pacific strategies. Well, you don't publish an Indo-Pacific strategy that doesn't, that's not centered on India. It's not just the United States that has an Indo-Pacific strategy. You have more and more of America's core allies and partners in Europe, in the Indo-Pacific, have Indo-Pacific strategies. It's an acknowledgement that India is becoming more consequential. So if you look, and I'll make just one last point on its diplomacy. I don't think that India is going to cede its place in the BRICS. I think, India senses that, look, if we're a member of a given grouping, let's leverage that membership for what we can get out of it. But I don't think that India is going to allocate going forward. I think that relatively India is probably going to allocate less energy to the BRICS than it does to alternative groupings. So what are some of those groupings? I think that India is going to invest more and more energy in revitalizing the quadrilateral security dialogue, better known as the Quad. I think that India has been really significantly expanding its diplomatic efforts across the Gulf. And I think particularly I'm thinking of the I2U2 forum. So this is Israel, India, the United States, and the United Arab Emirates.
They call it the other Quad, don't they? I think they call it
exactly.
Quad.
That's right. Exactly. Yeah. I think that India, again, look, it's a member of the BRICS, but they're probably are going to be diminishing diplomatic returns from India's perspective to spending a lot of time in the BRICS. So I think that India, again, it's spending more time in the Quad, it's spending more time in the I2U2. It's, I think, moving in, ways that are perhaps underappreciated. It's also moving, quite strongly to strengthen its overall ties with the European Union. So India is, but having said all of that, just circling back to some comments I made at the outset of our conversation, I think that this is very important. When we look at the relationship between the United States and India, it is strengthening on a multifaceted basis, and I think that strengthening will continue on a bipartisan basis. But there will be differences between the two countries, and I think it's important. India is not, India, yes, it's diversifying away from Russian energy. It's diversifying away from Russian arms. But that diversification doesn't take place overnight. That diversification away from Russia will take a long time. India has a relationship with Iran, and that relationship is not going to disappear. And even outside the realm of just kind of interstate, geopolitics, there are tensions between the United States and India on certain transnational challenges. Climate change, I think, is one. I think that the United States would like India and other countries in the developing world to accelerate their green energy transitions. And I think that India certainly is moving in that direction. But I think that India is saying, look, we have a very high rate of poverty. We have a huge middle class that we have to lift up. And so, yes, we are going green as fast as we can, but it would certainly help if the West were to put forward more financing for climate adaptation. So I think you see tensions on climate change. If you look at India's diplomacy, it's agile, it's pragmatic, it's omnidirectional. And I think that more and more middle powers and developing countries are going to try and adopt that diplomatic style so that they can maximize their agency as great power competition intensifies.
No, 100%. I think India is this sort of model. It was one of the founding members of the non-aligned movement, as we know, and it's as I say, it's been highly effective. I mean, the US and India do have a lot of overlapping interests, technological evolution, commercial trade links. There are some cultural overlaps there. The democracy front values, even if the democracy models are slightly different, if you really want to get into the intricate details, versus, as I said before, in the past, I think maybe even with you, to friends of my own, India is being pushed away by China, not pulled by the US, because India doesn't need to be pulled by the US.
Yes. May I just sort of make one?
Let me go on, Ali, go for it.
The point that you just made is incredibly important. It's underappreciated. Now, I don't want to understate, going to our earlier parts of our conversation, I don't want to understate the degree of geopolitical overlap between the United States and India. There is significant and growing geopolitical overlap. But I think it's very important to note what's transpired the past 3 years is, so first with the coronavirus pandemic, then the border skirmishes, but just I think it's sort of a broad, and then of course, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. What we're seeing in Delhi is it's less about responding to U.S. exhortations than it is about recalibrating independently of its own volition in response to how China is conducting itself. But I want to emphasize as well, the border dispute between China and India rightly gets a lot of attention, but the border dispute is part of a much broader rivalry between the two. So China and India are competing not just over the line of actual control. They're competing over which country is seen as the true champion of the developing world. They are competing over which country in the Indo-Pacific plays a greater role in determining global technology standards. They are playing, so they're competing, and of course, they're competing in the security domain. But I want to make clear 2 points. One, that what we've seen in the past 3 years is that India is aligning itself more with the United States, less because of what the United States is saying and more because of what China is doing and more because of India's own recalibration, number one. And number two, while the map that China's published is rightly getting a lot of attention, the border dispute is only one component of a much broader and expanding rivalry between India and China.
No, absolutely. And that brings me to the second to last question, actually, which is about this idea of, transactionality used as a basis in these bodies, in these multilateral international bodies versus a values-based system. So for context, in people in the West, we've largely been driven by, democracy, a rules-based order, economic liberalization, these sorts of things, right? But then on the other side, there are countries that we still engage with, even though they're not democracies. You can check out the video above now for an illustration of that about, democracy versus non-democratic orders. And so, Ali, simple question to you and quick fire from you is, are we going to see a sort of shift away from values-based alliances like this and more just based purely on transactionality? Or do you think that the Western style is going to remain prominent within the West and we're not going to sell out to sort of being just more transactional?
I think they're going to coexist. And I know that answer sounds evasive, and it may well be evasive, but I think that we are going to see elements of both. So if you look at, for example, and we were talking just before hopping on the call, if you look at the G7, the G7 is quite cohesive in part because of shared ideological alignment. There's a reason why you have 7 advanced industrial democracies that are increasingly aligned geopolitically, but there is an underlying, a significant underlying ideological component that glues them together. And it's an ideological component that is not nearly as pronounced in this expanded BRICS grouping, is not nearly as pronounced in the G20. So I think, and we will see that whether it's from a U.S. perspective, whether it's deepening its investment in the G7, deepening its investment in the Quad, I think that the United States is going to continue. I think the United States is most comfortable when it is dealing with other democracies. And I think that the United States is going to strengthen its investments in the G7 and the Quad. At the same time, there's a recognition, I think a growing recognition, that in order to push back on further Russian aggression, in order to, contest China in a durable way, you need as many hands on deck as possible. And so if you restrict yourself in terms of coalition building efforts, if you restrict yourself to countries that cross every, T and dot every I in terms of ideological alignment, you're going to restrict quite significantly the scope of your potential coalition. And so what we will see, I think, more and more of is efforts to, in parallel, double down on the G7, double down on the Quad, but in parallel, expand relationships with countries that we might find somewhat problematic ideologically, because there's a recognition that without, say, the Vietnams of the world, without the Philippines of the world, without, the Indonesias of the world. I mean, there are going to be countries, again, that you might not align with purely ideologically, but you recognize that not having them on board strategically will be to your detriment. So I think that those efforts will proceed in parallel. I'll just make one last point, which is whether you look at the world ideologically, geopolitically, economically, it's becoming much messier, much more fluid, much more complex. And I think that any sustainable foreign policy has to reflect that complexity. And again, the vast majority of countries in the world, many of them right now, that were already economically stressed and credit stressed prior to COVID-19, they've now been further battered because of the pandemic, because of destabilizations to food and energy markets. They're going to be thinking in much more pragmatic terms. So they say, look, I need to lift up my middle class. I need infrastructure. I need digital connectivity. And they're not going to pay too much heed to the ideological orientation of the country that provides them with assistance in that regard. And so as that competition plays out to curry favor with countries in the developing world, I think that we'll need to be mindful that leaning too much into ideology is probably not going to win favor with those countries that are thinking much more pragmatically about how to get themselves out of their developmental challenges.
So that leads smoothly, Ali, into the last question I have for you, which is expansionism again, but specifically we're talking about transactionality. And one of the things that we've seen with transactionality is China's, use of BRI. It's very impressive. And one of the countries that I said I want to use as a case study is Argentina. Now, China has, bailed Argentina out, I think, quite a few times. The swap lines amounting to about $230 billion in total. And Argentina has had to do this like 8 times in 8 years, do these things. And it's just basically this transactionality that is an interesting part about the BRICS. But, Argentina is considering dollarizing because of their economy at 115% inflation. And yet they've just joined the BRICS as the expanded BRICS 11. What is going on with that? Can you don't have to use Argentina as an example in your response, but just, why this confusion around expansionism and then sort of different choices being made despite if my question makes sense, very poorly put.
It does. So I'll just make 2 points. I think that what Argentina's, conduct, again, it's emblematic of this balancing act that many members of the BRICS are engaging in. So Argentina, sure, in certain ways, China is courting Argentina, but Argentina is not going to abandon its relationship with the United States. So point one would just be what Argentina is doing. It's emblematic of this balancing act. Number two, just on kind of a geoeconomic point, there's no question that the BRICS member countries will experiment more with trading with one another in local currencies, non-dollar currencies. But the reality is that now, over the medium term to long term, we may begin to see some gradual erosion or some gradual diminution in the centrality of the dollar in global finance. But a lot of obituaries that have been written for the dollar have proven premature. In times of crisis, many countries tend to gravitate towards the dollar. If you look at the Chinese currency, so long as China's economy is configured the way that it is, it's going to be very difficult for China's currency to become a credible global reserve currency alternative to the dollar. And so we shouldn't get too carried away with predictions of de-dollarization. To the extent that de-dollarization occurs, it's going to be very piecemeal, very incremental, and very gradual.
And this whole idea of a common currency, I think we should always draw a distinction between, wanting to do more bilateral trade through, your local currencies versus wanting to create an entirely new global currency with which the renminbi is nowhere near ready. And equally, what would they have to do? They'd have to take some inspiration from the Eurozone in creating that new currency amongst this block. How on earth are you going to do that over the geographical proximity? It's not Europe. It's Brazil and Argentina and then Russia on the other side of the globe. So it's not just physically speaking that easy to do. But Ali, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll be sure to have you back again. If you enjoyed this conversation, everyone, leave it a like, leave it a, subscribe, leave a comment if you disagreed with me or Ali. I'm sure some of you will, probably me. Ali speaks far too much sense. And I will see you all in a future episode. Take care, everyone.